Hey, good morning, everybody. Uh, Welcome to Tuesday the 21st. Hope you're all doing well. And I'm going to try to get through the rest of these notes today. I have this PowerPoint ready to go. So let's just get right into it. I know I talked about this page, and I was noticing as I looked back, I'm really glad that I uh, covered up the key up here in the left-hand corner of the Cold War Eastern Bloc uh, Iron Curtain, but the Eastern Bloc countries because I noticed that this map that I borrowed, which is otherwise a good map, has blue marked as the Eastern Bloc, which is not the case. Blue is the Western Bloc, red is the Eastern Bloc. Anyway, so silliness. I know that we were on the next page, the next slide here. So West Germany, and we're going to talk about how West Germany was initially after the war divided into three main areas: the British-controlled area, the French-controlled area, and the American-controlled area. This little province of Saarland was a little separate, but um, basically you have British, French, and American, and then the red here is the Russian Soviet area. Within the Soviet controlled area, East Germany, you had Berlin, and Berlin is blown up here a little bit. So this is the city of Berlin, again, here in East Germany. And um, the Soviets controlled the red area, and once again, you have France in blue, Britain in green, and America in this yellow. And so West Berlin, West Germany, I'm sorry, West Berlin here, and then West Germany, these three, East Germany, and East Berlin on the inside there. Anyway, you're going to see these transportation corridors, the Frankfurt and Hamburg, the cities they originated, Bruckenberg, um, corridors. This is where the food and supplies were supposed to come in to West Berlin, and at a certain point, we'll talk about how that became an issue. All right. So again, some of the early things that were going on. Um, Obviously, we have Truman trying to contain communism. And so this issue of containment, or this vocabulary of containment, is something that you need to know. The idea of trying to keep it contained, within a box of some sort. So it was Truman's idea to try to stop the spread of communism. You'll see that in the Truman Doctrine, and then you see it in various places throughout the Cold War. Britain specifically giving aid to Greece to fight communist leaders, Americans sending some support for the Turks fighting against the Soviets. Um, and then later we'll see the Korean War and the Vietnam War and other specific instances. There were many, but you see this idea of containment started with Truman in the late 40s, right after the Second World War. One of the things the video points out, you may remember from last week, watching the video, and there's the picture of Stalin all happy that Europe has been so devastated and everybody's so poor. Well, when people are poor, when people are struggling, they're going to be more likely to try a new form of government. And communism is a particular form of government that appeals. Remember, we talked about communism appealing to the lower class and fascism appealing to the middle class. We talked about that when we talked about fascism. Anyway, so the Americans see this huge issue as well, that Europe is devastated, and worrying that France or Spain or Western Europe, any of the countries in Western Europe, might fall to communism. The Americans came up with this thing that we call the Marshall Plan, named after the gentleman who sort of really came up with it. And basically what it was is this large economic aid, a plan to help Europe. And again, we see that poverty leads to the popularity of communism, and so the Marshall Plan is instituted in the late 1940s, 1947, 48, to make sure that Western Europe would not be poor. That's basically what the Marshall Plan is. This comes actually from your textbook, and you also might remember from the video that communism, that Stalin wouldn't allow the communist countries in the Eastern Bloc to accept any of the aid, and he came up with some alternative forms of aiding them. The Comecon, we saw that, and a couple other things too. But you'll see here, where you'd expect most of the money to go. Our biggest allies, Great Britain and France, that's where most of it went. Italy, trying to keep it from becoming fascist or communist as well. West Germany, obviously, being supported by the United States now. And then Holland, the Netherlands, Austria, Belgium, and Luxembourg, Greece, Denmark, Norway, Turkey. Again, we saw Greece and Turkey come up in their battles with communism, and the American and British support for that. Ireland, Sweden, Portugal. The only one here you see that had any connections to the Eastern Bloc is Yugoslavia, and that sort of happened a little bit later. But anyway, so you can see, obviously, that the majority of the money, millions of dollars, went to these Western European countries. None of it went to Poland, Czechoslovakia, Bulgaria, Albania, all of those countries in the Eastern Bloc, beyond the Iron Curtain. So anyway, you don't have to write these numbers down. I just wanted to let you see, sort of visualize what it was. All right. So as we saw on that map of Germany, and that the three Allied forces, France, Britain, and the United States, sort of had divided up West Germany into three regions where they were sort of taking care of things. Well, a few years after the war, they decided that they were going to just unite it all into West Germany. And that's what this was, that it had been divided into those three areas. And then you have Berlin, again, in East Germany, and Stalin. And again, if you recall the video, there was freedom within Berlin for East Germans to pass over to the West German side, or East Berliners to go to the West Berlin side, and they could see and experience some of the fun of capitalism, and generally having more access to different kinds of goods and a different kind of lifestyle. And Stalin was frustrated by this constant issue in Berlin. So in his mind, he wanted Berlin to be completely communist, and completely in East Germany. So as this sort of was happening, where West Germany was uniting, Stalin decides to try to cut off those pathways, those three arrows we saw on the map, for bringing in supplies into West Berlin. So he sort of, thumbed his nose at the West and said, "Yeah, you can't drive in here with your supplies anymore." And so over a period of time, Truman and led some of the other Allied forces, France and Britain, and created an airlift. They would use planes to drop the supplies into West Berlin. And it sort of outsmarted Stalin, and he sort of took that as a bit of a loss. All right, more tensions coming. America and the Western European nations see a lot of this communist movement, and so what they did is they formed NATO, North Atlantic Treaty Organization. And so the North Atlantic Treaty Organization was 10 Western European countries, USA, and Canada, and it was a defensive military alliance to protect themselves against the communist invasion. Um, Eventually, 6 years later, the Warsaw Pact was formed, and this is in the USSR, the Soviets, and some of the Eastern Bloc countries doing some of the same idea as NATO, trying to make a more powerful connection. All right, the arms race starts. So obviously, in 1945, some people use that date, that August 6th and August 9th, as the beginning of the Cold War, the dropping of the atomic bombs in Japan. Well, for 4 years, the United States had the atomic bomb and the Soviets did not. In 1945, Soviets successfully tested the first atomic bomb. Uh, about 100 times more powerful was the hydrogen bomb, which the United States started to develop. And the main difference is um, there are lots of differences, but it's a fission versus a fusion bomb, and fission has to do with separating atoms, and when you separate them, they caused a big boom, and that's the atomic bomb. Fission was pushing them together, and that's what the hydrogen bomb was, and it was an even bigger explosion, again, like 100 times larger. Well, the following year, the USSR, the Soviets, they were able to test successfully their first hydrogen bomb. So you just see this. In the 50s, saw the beginning of this huge military escalation on both sides. Missiles and atomic weapons and hydrogen bombs and bigger hydrogen bombs and more hydrogen bombs and the ability, all the different kinds of things that would just build up ships and planes and all of that. So we start to see the arms race really take off. All right. Another race that happens is the space race. And again, you don't need to write down all of these, but do just take a moment to look. You have the Soviets starting in 1957 launching Sputnik, which was a big thing, and it was the first satellite. America's launches their satellite the next year. And early in 1961, Yuri Gagarin becomes, it's hard to see his name with that popping up, hopefully that'll go away in a minute. He becomes the first man in space, and then Alan Shepard goes up for the Americans. And you can sort of see this, but again, you get to 1969, and this was such a huge event in American history because of this history of the space race itself, but also the Cold War. We beat the Russians, we beat the Soviets. That was the American feeling about the moon landing, and so the moon landing is obviously a huge deal because it's the first time anyone was able to do that. But it's also a really big deal in the context of the Cold War. Again, you don't have to know all of these, but you can sort of see this space race. And it is interesting to note that in 1975, as we, not at the end of the Cold War, but as we're nearing the end of the Cold War, you see the first combined space mission between the Soviets and the United States. Anyway, space race was part of this Cold War too. The final thing that I wanted to talk about, I only have about a minute and a half to try to do it, and I put the fall of China to communism in quotation marks. It's only a fall from the American perspective that communism is bad, and you don't necessarily have to believe that. And so I don't want to paint it that way. But in the Cold War perspective, that's the way Americans felt about it. Is that this fall of China to communism was this horrific, terrible thing? This huge nation of China was now communist and got left off of your United States made maps and things like that for the 50s and 60s. And we wouldn't go there. We wouldn't recognize the government and all sorts of stuff. But again, as I run out of time here, I just point out that the fall is from the American perspective. That civil war that had been going on from the 20s until 1950 pitted the nationalists versus the communists. And the nationalists were Jiang Jiechi, or Chiang Kai-shek is the way I've always heard it, but it sort of has changed how we rewrite the Chinese language. If we were in school, I would ask for some help from some of our friends in our class that would help me with pronunciation. Anyway, the nationalists lost and eventually moved to Taiwan. Communists led by Mao Zedong won. And I'm going to put the last slide up so you can look at it.